welcome back to the next session. I think we're live. My name is John O'Brien. I work for Deloitte. I run their decarbonisation group. For a long time, I used to run Australian Cleantech and the Melbourne Cleantech network. It's great to see that the Victorian Cleantech cluster is growing from what was not much more than a thought bubble a few years ago to something really meaningful and powerful. So great to see that growth. So we've got a great session here thinking about visions and the future, and a couple of great speakers with us. And please Q&A, send through your questions. We'll get to those at the end. We're going to hear from a couple of great speakers first. First of all, I'd like to introduce Rupert Posner. So Rupert has been around a long time in this game, possibly even longer than me, which is saying something. In the 90s, he was very much involved in the whole sort of environment movement before things took off. He was involved in the Sydney Olympics and was very involved in the climate group when they had a good operation here. So wonderful to welcome Rupert. Over to you.
Hi, thanks very much for that, John. Appreciate it. And yeah, I don't know whether it's so long, but anyway.
Doesn't feel like it, huh?
No, it doesn't. And it is exciting times. It really is exciting times, and certainly feel like the sort of change that we've been talking about for a long time is starting to happen. So anyway, hopefully the presentation that I'll run through will give some thoughts. I'm currently working with Climate Works Australia. I'll just see if I can share my screen so that people can see my presentation. That seems to have worked okay, so that's great. What I'd like to do is we'll run through this slide shortly. For those of you who are not familiar with Climate Works, we're part of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University, and with support from the Maya Foundation, long ongoing support for over more of a decade, we're bridging research and action that is necessary to get Australia and the region onto a net zero pathway. So kind of in a way, we're a think and a do tank. And so a little bit of the presentation today will be some of the thinking work that we've done. And obviously there's lots of doing that we're doing in trying to implement that. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Back in 2014, we undertook some deep decarbonisation pathways work, which really was the first time that showed that Australia can reach net zero emissions by 2050. But what we've done over the last 2 years is essentially build on that work and investigated what's needed to get us onto a net zero by 2050 pathways. And we've broken it down into 5 different sectors: electricity, buildings, transport, industry, and agriculture and land. And so what we've done is, through this report, is provided a review of the technologies that are available to reduce emissions, look at what business, government and individuals can do to deploy those technologies, and modelled scenarios to see what's needed in each of those sectors that is comparable with a transition that is needed of 2.2 or 1.5 degrees in warming. And as part of that, it presents some benchmarks, particularly by 2030, of where we need to be achieved. And I think it provides some really interesting insights of what the future could look like, and obviously business opportunities as well. As I'm sure many of you have heard of, back in 2015, all the world's governments committed to trying to keep global warming well below 2 degrees, and ideally around 1.5 degrees. And since then, we've seen quite a lot of commitments to net zero by 2050 targets, and it's increasingly becoming the norm. And the important thing about these targets is that they then drive behaviour, which means changes in technology. So this is a really important first step. All Australian states and territories now have net zero targets or aspirations in place, and Federal government's a little slower coming, but I suspect they will be joining that commitment of net zero by 2050 very soon. Countries around the world representing more than 65% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and more than 70% of the world's economies have now made really strong commitments to net zero emissions. And importantly, you know, some of our key trading partners, the European Union, Japan, Korea, as well as another 100-odd countries, have committed to net zero by 2050. And China as well has now committed to net zero by 2060. This has also been supported by action from business as well, with an increasing number of businesses making commitments to net zero by 2050 or earlier. Originally, this was in those sectors that were a little bit easier to abate, the property sector, for example, but now we're seeing the really energy-intensive sectors, you know, like Rio and others that are committing to net zero as well. So really starting to build some momentum in this area. So how do we get to net zero? Well, we've looked at sort of 4 pillars that are needed to get there. It's about reducing energy waste. That's largely through energy efficiency and productivity and shifting away from those very energy intensive products. It's about committing to 100% to renewable energy. It's about electrifying and shifting from fossil fuel processes to electricity that's obviously supported by renewable energy, and as well looking at those non-energy emissions and, you know, offsetting for those small residual emissions that can't be reduced themselves. To get there, Australia needs to really leapfrog to zero emission technology and processes, and we need to do that rapidly. We really do need to accelerate the deployment of mature technologies, and indeed those demonstrated technologies. We need to deploy them at scale and at pace. But obviously, at the same time, we need to continue to invest and accelerate the deployment of emerging technologies, because while we need a whole lot of emission reduction done right now, that process will continue for some decades, and we need to continue to invest in research and development. The good news is that, you know, what's changed since we did our original report back in 2014? Well, what we've found is that there has been remarkable progress across a whole range of technologies. I think, you know, many people will be aware of the uptake of solar, and that really has been quite remarkable. So, you know, solar installations achieved in 5 years what was expected to take 20 years. So by 2016, the cumulative solar installations was what was expected by 2030 back in 2010. And we now have renewable energy that is unequivocally, lower to quote CSIRO, and I mean CSIRO, cheaper than fossil fuel. So that's really exciting. We're constantly seeing improvements in batteries that are rapidly decreasing in cost, and, you know, you won't miss a month without one state coming out with a new, bigger battery, which is exciting news. And each time the costs are coming down. EVs, now, while we're a bit slow here, there are more than 3 million of them around the world, and, you know, every car manufacturer is rapidly increasing the number of electric vehicle models that are coming out. We're even seeing areas that are very difficult to decarbonise, such as electric planes and ships. Admittedly, they're still relatively small, but we are seeing activity in that area. And of course, there's been loads of coverage of some of the meat alternatives that have been growing massively over the last few years. In the report, we've identified some of the demonstrated and mature technologies that are available and can be used to address emissions reduction in all of those scales. So we've talked about some of them before. It's about renewable energy, including batteries. These are mature, but there are obviously, these need to be deployed at scale. Buildings, there are huge improvements that can be done in energy efficiency and electrification. The ACT government just came out recently with a commitment to its new hospital there that will be 100% electric, obviously electric vehicles for light road transport needs to be deployed. And if you go through the report, it goes through all the different examples of the technologies that are available there. Part of this process was modelling to see what would be needed using the technologies that we have and know to meet either a 2 degree or a 1.5 degree target by 2050 or 2035. And this gives you a visual representation. But what it does show is that we need really significant emission reduction by 2030. So between 50 and 75% reduction in emissions will be needed this decade compared with 2030. In our report, we also go through and look at some of the benchmarks, some of the targets that need to be met in different sectors if we're going to stay on that pathway. So, for example, with electric cars, we need, between 50 and 75% of all new car sales in Australia to be electric. Current government projections are around 20%. So we need to see a real increase in the policies to encourage electric vehicle take-up. Renewable energy, while we've seen really good policies from the state governments and they continue to increase, which is really promising, we will need to see between 70 and 80% of all our electricity by the end of the decade to be renewable to keep us on path with our Paris commitments. And as I mentioned earlier, the important thing is that we continue to invest in those emerging technologies. So it's great to deliver the emission reductions that we need by 2030, but there will continue to be emissions reductions that will be required after that date. And so we need to continue to invest in renewable hydrogen, biofuels, and agriculture and some of the meat alternative products to ensure that we continue on the pathway that's needed to get there by 2050. And clearly, while these pathways are achievable with the technologies that we've got available today and the ones that are expected to come online, it won't just happen automatically. We need actions from government, business and individuals. We really need government to set some really strong policies to encourage the deployment of these technologies in all of the sectors. And we need the businesses to continue to make commitments, but also to follow through and deliver on those commitments and ensure that their emission reductions do take place. So just to click on the next button, which is a bit stuck here. Apologies for that. As I mentioned, this really is the transformational decade. This is the decade, because we haven't taken the action earlier, we need to see a massive reduction in emissions. We need to see the deployment of new technologies across all of the sectors. And if we do it, and we certainly can with the technologies that are now available, then we can remain on track to meet our Paris commitments. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Rupert. That was great. And ClimateWorks have always done some amazing work, I think, in terms of setting the agenda of how to do stuff. There's lots of talk around, we have to do it, but I think ClimateWorks have done a great job on actually sort of saying, okay, and this is the pathway. And when we come back to questions later, I'd love to jump into sort of the carbon budget work that maybe ClimateWorks did a few years ago, and because I think that's a really important bit that is often not used, and and kind of how many months have we got left at our current rate of emissions before we do we've basically 1.5. So we might come back to that in a little while. So thank you, Rupert, and we'll go to our second speaker, Damien Thomas. Welcome, Damien. Damien's also been around for a little while in the sector. I think I first bumped into you when you were running the materials group at CSIRO, but you've been at RMIT since then, and you're currently running a group called Kin8, commercialising all those technologies that we need. So welcome, Damien, and over to you.
Thanks very much, John. Very nice to be here. And you're right, we've all been around a little bit too long, perhaps. Look, I wanted to actually just share my screen if I could. Oops. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, so look, my thanks to the Cleantech cluster for inviting Kinnate and myself to discuss the issue of commercialising technology in Australia. This is a large part of the work that Kinnate does, and we work with companies, universities and governments to assist the commercialisation and translation and achievement of social, environmental and economic change with technology. And if your company is considering how you'd like to improve your innovation readiness or develop a structured approach to technology-based market opportunities, then please talk to me and to Kinnate. So look, I wanted to get you to ask yourself a question. Stop for a moment just to ask yourself, if I wanted to really make my customers happy based on new technology, what innovation do I need and what would I get? Where would I get that technology? Would I build it in-house? Would I acquire the technology from a supplier or even a competitor? Or ask for a university to provide innovation and capability? Now, when we ask the question of how is Australia going in terms of technology commercialisation and what do we need to do to be better, we often think about technology which comes from universities. But there is plenty of technology and innovation originating in private companies. But first, you must be clear, what is the technology and innovation I need to make my customers happy, which will create profitable success for my company? So I'm asking you today, what's your answer to that? What technology and innovation would lift your own competitiveness? Now, if we do narrow the question down to how is Australia going in terms of university-based technology commercialisation, the answer is that we're not going very well. And we've been in that position for decades. It is true that Australia produces a great deal of world-ranked research, but very little of that is commercialised successfully. According to the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, Australia is ranked 40th in knowledge and technology outputs, and total earnings for university-based research were 176 million in 2019, and we established about 40 companies at that time. However, in that same year, we invested around 11 billion in university-based research. That return on investment would not be tolerated within a private company. At the end of 2020, the Australian government commissioned yet another study into getting stronger commercialisation outcomes. Now, this study is amongst dozens of other government studies over the last 40 years. The NERA Group in their recent statements indicated that Australia has an excellent record of research, but the commercialisation environment is challenged with significant barriers in the transfer of IP from universities and research organisations to the market. Recently, my company, Kinnate, conducted a project where we spoke to more than 20 Victorian-based companies about technology and whether they would like to secure that from universities. Now, every one of those companies indicated that they are seeking technology, but they'd rather not engage with the university because it's just too hard to connect and reach agreement. In February this year, John O'Brien, our host here this morning, and Antonia Flowers wrote an article which showed that the Deloitte Australian Cleantech Index rose by about 34% over the quarter to 2020 in December. And now that significantly outperformed the already strong growth of the ASX 200, which was going very well during that quarter as well. The companies included in the index that John was referring to range across renewable energy, energy efficiency, resource efficiency, energy storage, battery minerals and water treatment. So we do know that technology-based companies can thrive and are thriving. All future industry and competitive success will be built on technology, innovation and highly skilled people. So we must commercialise much more effectively. Technology commercialisation operates well in an environment where the actors do not act alone. Companies and industries can go alone and be successful, but wouldn't it be great if they could partner with universities which have so much potential to offer? Government, through creating an environment and clarifying the role universities can make a great contribution to building the right environment. Today, I'll talk about the role of government, industry and universities and their roles and contributions to technology commercialisation. I'll kick this off by talking about government. What is their role and how are they going about that role in successful innovation systems, not only here in Australia, but around the world? Secondly, I'll talk about what I see as the industry role and private sector's role. And thirdly, I'll talk to the role that universities could play and where their focus should be if they wanted to see more of their technology being commercialised by Australian companies. Government The first part of this is a very important player in technology commercialisation. Government can identify big challenges and focuses for the country. What is it that Australia needs to be good at, and what are the large problems do we need to solve? The Australian government's Clean Energy Finance Corporation has invested more than $10 billion in bioenergy, climate, housing, property and infrastructure retrofit and innovation. We've also invested in manufacturing and agriculture. Now, this fund, amongst other initiatives, is clearly spelling out where Australia needs to focus technology. Government can create clarity about targets and expectations through policy. You can see this sense of clarity in places like Germany, Switzerland, Singapore and China. Those governments clearly articulate their expectations of each member of the technology value chain and hold them accountable. Funding support to university depends on their response to government ambitions. What is failing in technology commercialisation has been studied many times before, so I don't think we actually need too many more studies. We need to take action, create direction, establish accountability. It's a little bit like the way Rupert was talking about before. The second actor within the environment is industry, which will bring clear commercial and customer-based focus. Companies have a clear idea of what their customers need and therefore can gain a first-hand view of how technology can allow them to provide products and services which support their own customers. Building the success of your customers is a certain way to make yourself invaluable to the customer, which leads to profitability and competitive advantage. This focus ensures that the technology is not a trivial pursuit of developing technology to allow the publishing of an interesting journal article without a view to how that technology can be successfully introduced to the market. Industry can ensure that technology is directed at customer needs and creates urgency to get the innovative product or service into the market. Industry also brings investment through their own capital raising, or in the case of new companies, through venture capital. Industry will bring people together and create employment, which allows technology to be commercialised. Industry understands that technology must create a return on investment, which competes with their other investment opportunities. Technology must pay its way in that context. I've seen this play out with highly innovative small and large companies such as Techstore Technology, Planet Innovation, General Electric International in the United States and around the world, Hydroterra here in Australia, Boeing in Australia and around the world. Now, those companies are very clear on what customer-based problem the technology is trying to solve, and then they spell that out so that the technology program is directed at, and not some random activity focused on the researcher's favourite topic, as we can sometimes see in Australian universities. Now, the third player in this system is, of course, the universities. Universities in Australia and their researchers can imagine some of the world's best technology concepts and potential innovation. But they're very unlikely to see that technology commercialised without working with others. In fact, most of the technology concepts from universities are very early stage and likely to be in technology readiness levels of 1 to 3 on the 9-point TRL scale. Universities are very heavily focused on the student experience today. Approximately 90% of university revenues come from students, or HECS, which is student fees by another name. And so they direct their attention to students. That makes sense. Which customer is paying? The student. So let's focus our attention there. The role of research and development at a university in that context is to build their rankings through paper and journal publication rankings to attract students to come to the university. Now, Louise Johnson is an honorary Deakin University academic, and she recently indicated that universities are partly to blame for their current problems. They are chasing foreign student fees to fund the research needed to build their global rankings, aimed at securing yet more international students. It's a circle which is not aimed at technology commercialisation. Universities must be clear that they want to grow Australian industry and employment rather than wrap up IP in contested discussions with industry about who owns the patent. An important contribution that universities can make is in graduating high quality people who have the ability to bring technology and innovation to life when those people go to work in advanced Australian companies. So the partners to this well-functioning innovation system are governments, which can bring focus, incentives, and build real and virtual innovative environments. The second actor in the innovation system is industry, which brings clear commercial clarity and urgency to what the technology must achieve. And then finally, there is the role of the university. They can create future employees with strong technology skills, and if they choose to work closely with industry, they can assist in bringing some technology concepts to life. Australia does not need to have a highly functioning innovation system. In fact, we've seen many Australian companies succeed without working closely with universities. However, it would be great to have an Australian innovation system which works closely to the strategic benefit of the nation and competes with some of the great innovation systems around the world. Thank you.
Great overview, and and thank you for the plug for the Australian Cleantech Index. Not that wasn't set up, but it comes actually. We're going to go to Q&A, and we've got some great questions coming through. So if you're watching, please put the questions into the chat box, into the Q&A thing there. I've probably got a couple to get us going, just to get things going. The Cleantech Index, so I actually started publishing that in 2008. Can you believe it? For many years, it actually lost a lot of money, but the whole point was this is all about opportunity. The world is going to change. There are lots of opportunity, and we're going to end up in a better place. And you've talked, Damien, about sort of industry and how to increase competitiveness and effectiveness. The recent, over the last 6 months or so, companies like BHP and FMG have kind of tried to reposition their business. They're going, actually, decarbonisation is an opportunity for our business and our shareholders, and we're going to make money out of this. And Rupert, you've been around sort of working out how to do this, and with Climate Works and other places. How do you see the communications of clean tech and climate? How do we make this more into an opportunity? And it's kind of what appealed to me about clean tech when I first heard the word back in 2003 or whenever it was, because if we get people excited about going somewhere, then they're more likely to actually move. So what are your views on that?
You go first, Rupert.
Oh, okay, thanks for that. Yeah, look, really good question, John, because I think a lot of people who've been working in this space for some time, it just seems so obvious to do it. So the benefits are, there are so many benefits of shifting to cleaner technology. So I think one of the, the old challenge we've got is, we don't have a price on carbon. I don't know whether we can discuss that too much, but that would facilitate quite a lot of changes from business, because one of the challenges we have at the moment is that they still have to deliver profits for their shareholders and the like, and so they're not charities. So while we're seeing a massive scale up on what they're doing, there needs to be greater requirement to make those changes. So then the question is, well, why don't we put those requirements in place? And I think there is a real challenge for some people to imagine a different future. Yep. And so people are very comfortable doing the things they've always done before. And it's been good for Australia. We've done well. The quality of life for people in Australia is really good. And it's hard to imagine that a different scenario could not only be just as good, it might actually be a whole lot better. What's different now is that I think people are starting to see that the writing is on the wall and that we have to change, not just for environmental reasons, but also for business reasons. So if you look at the number of countries and our key trading partners that are committing to net zero emissions, it means, all of our businesses that are exporting and hope to do business with those countries are going to need to change the way they do things. And if they don't do that, there's a potential that we'll get left behind. And so I'm hopeful that even though we should have done this decades ago, and some people did, look at the solar development in Australia, Martin Green out of New South Wales, amazing stuff that has had a real impact around the world. So we can be proud about that. But I'm hopeful now that we're in a better position, that we'll get the sort of support and policies that are needed from government, and that companies will embrace these opportunities. Yeah,
I fully agree. And reading the paper this morning, we've almost got a net zero target. Not quite, but it's we will sometime very soon. And the other bit about sort of thinking about who is moving. I think there's countries moving as well, but we do a lot of work with sort of TCFD reporting, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So all the biggest companies and the Australian companies are coming along, but the multinationals are all reporting on that, and increasingly having to drive that down through their supply chain. So if any company is in the supply chain of a multinational who has any climate targets, then they're going to have to adapt if they still want to be in that supply chain. And I think that's also going to make a big difference. So, Damien, on the positive stories, how do we make people move to a better world?
Well, I think we're ready for it, aren't we? I think we've been ready for it for a long time. So I reckon you wouldn't have an argument with the 24 or 25 million, probably the 6 billion people on the planet if we had our choice. So I think actually we're doing a pretty good job. I think the market's ready to receive the innovations that allow us to be cleaner. And the other thing that I'm optimistic about is that my time spent in research organisations, CSIRO and universities, is the way that our scientific community communicates. It's much more effective today than it's ever been. And I think it's a paradoxical that, we have this challenge where some parts of the world, sometimes political, denying obvious scientific evidence, at the same time that our scientists are getting much more clear in the way they can communicate what they're learning. So I think and maybe that's why I'm quite optimistic about this, because with changes around the world of a political nature, then that's been the piece that's been missing. Because if consumers want cleaner products and companies are willing to make profits based on cleaner products, which they obviously are, and our scientific community is capable of delivering innovations and working with them, then I think we're in a pretty good spot. Now we just get the politicians on side, and they seem to be gradually moving. I don't think quite as fast as everyone would like, but still, I think there's lots of reason to be optimistic.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. As I'm a self-confessed stubborn optimist, and there's for another slight plug, a book I published in 2015 in the Paris Climate Conference, Visions, was all about how to tell stories of a better world. So go and have a look at that if you're interested. Now we've got some good questions coming through, and we'll start with one for Rupert there. Given your long-standing involvement in the environment, climate change sector, has Australia's progress matched your expectations, and if not, why not? And I think you've talked about the priorities for the next decade, but what has held us back, and what is changing now that is going to stop holding us back?
Yeah, look, I think most people will be aware that federal politics has held us back, and we've had a really unfortunate situation that has taken place over the last decade or so. But
more than that, what's caused that federal? I mean, there's kind of the politicians are there to get elected, and we all have strong views on some of them. But what's up behind that? Do you think?
Well, I think also there was a real split, and there was probably not a desire to work together or collaboratively to address the solutions. And so whatever approach was presented, there was a side that wasn't happy with it, and as a result, perfect was the enemy of the good, and we didn't get the things that were needed, unfortunately. Now, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say, well, actually, something not as good as we wanted would have been better than nothing, and nothing is what's happened. I guess we need to learn from that. I think we are in a better position now, because I think business is much stronger and actually wants government action. And I think there are a number of people who are leading senior businesses now that are not aware that they played a role in stopping things happen in the past. So there's new leadership in a number of these companies. So I think that's promising. And I think understanding what's happening in the global sphere is helping things. The challenge is how do you maintain that enthusiasm and excitement, and also maintain the urgency of action? So yes, there are great opportunities. There are fantastic technologies, and we can all do it. But at the same time, it will only happen at the pace we need if we move quickly. And so it's really trying to manage that. I think the innovators, the new companies, need to ensure that they're talking to their local political representatives so that they can get excited about the businesses in their areas, and that they don't just hear from the old incumbents, recognising many of those old incumbents are starting to change what they're talking about. But it's important for us to hear about these exciting new technologies. There's some great stuff that's been invented in Australia in the past. Unfortunately, a lot of it's gone overseas. If we can encourage Australian governments to, provide a market for that in Australia, then hopefully the rest of the community can get excited as well.
Yep. And Damien, any thoughts on what's been holding us back and why we're now going to just fly and get it all sorted?
This flying and getting it all sorted probably is a question for another day. But I think Rupert's probably onto it. I think that, again, at a political level, we haven't managed to reach a consensus that said that this made common sense for us in a range of ways, not only to make our planet a cleaner place, but also for people to make this a successful economic outcome. For some reason, we spent a long time debating whether or not we had, there were choices that we could have a cleaner environment and therefore we would lose profitability rather than having both at the same time. And it's an interesting thing that we actually found ourselves in that discussion. Probably goes back a long time. But no, I think Rupert's right. I think getting consensus around these questions, getting the right leadership in place will help. And you mentioned business there, and one of the things we've been involved with is the Climate Leaders Coalition that was launched publicly last November. So there's 25 CEOs of sort of most of the biggest emitters, and we've got a whole lot more coming in. So there's definitely an appetite from big business to be moving there. The next question is kind of connected with that. So how do we get, so New Zealand has just introduced mandatory climate risk reporting, and the UK is heading that way for the largest companies. How do we get that? Is that going to be important for Australia, mandatory climate risk reporting, and does it prevent greenwashing? Sort of lots of companies saying, yeah, we're green, but still doing exactly what they used to do. Rupert, do you want to jump in?
I think that's definitely on the agenda, and I think that's likely to happen. I mean, one of the promising things that we heard from our federal climate change or emissions reduction minister is that he wanted companies to be held to account. So I think there is an opportunity for the federal government to take action in this response in this area, but we're also seeing increasingly companies recognising that they need to report on this. So we will probably see those sorts of requirements happen in Australia. Increasingly, companies know that they do need to be accountable, and there's less opposition from the leadership of companies when we have shareholder resolutions at AGM. So I think that's only a matter of time. And I think companies will be expected to be held to account, and also to demonstrate, we're seeing, a lot of financial institutions move away from funding fossil fuels because it's just not economic. And indeed, even now we're starting to see that happen in the gas sector, where there are gas assets that, in Spain, for example, that they're struggling to sell. And that's why we're seeing some of the challenge at the moment, because business doesn't want to invest in some of these infrastructure programs that they know will not be a good economic decision.
Yep. And on sort of the how to help big business sort of adopt new innovation and the stuff you're working with, Damien, one of the things I've seen has sort of been innovation challenges, and I think that's a really can be a really powerful way to pull out innovation and make it useful. It's to solve a real problem in a real business. Have you seen much of that happening in Australia, and is it something you would push?
I definitely would push it, John. In fact, I was very keen on that idea. We did a lot of large innovation challenges with, in fact, some very large companies, but then we started to migrate that across to smaller companies as well, because it's actually quite a detailed process to get into it properly. You have to have a high degree of trust between the company and the research group. But look, I definitely would push it, and I've seen that happening a lot more. There is still a tendency, however, of this idea that we push technology out of a university or out of a CSIRO And it's those innovations they can often be without a home because in fact there was a book I think called Rembrandt's in the Attic about this idea that we've got these marvelous stores of treasure sitting around that we haven't yet commercialized. Whereas companies will say, well, look, that's a marvelous invention, but it needs to be able to turn right rather than turn left, or they'll provide information about that innovation that needs to be built into the technology. So having technologies which are pulled out of university through capability and innovation, I think is probably a better process to go. But having said that, there are still going to be great innovations invented inside a university or a CSIRO for that matter, and then working out the right mechanisms to allow that to escape out of those places. I think CSIRO has done a lot of work on that in the past. I think there's still a fair degree of challenge inside universities, to be perfectly honest, but there are some great examples. In fact, right now our company Kinnate is working with a couple of really great examples, one at the University of Queensland where we're working really hard, and in fact the research group is sort of the perfect research group, if you like, to see a translation of an innovation or a technology, because they've said, look, we believe ourselves to be great technology inventors, but we don't know how to take it on this commercialization path. Can you help us? And then we've done what you've just said, John. We've said, okay, well, let's go and understand what market would actually need. What do customers need? What do companies need? And so if the innovation is not as required, how do we move that innovation over into that space so that we're actually running on parallel lines again? And so there are research groups around Australia that are quite good at it. Unfortunately, it's not as universal as I would like, at least.
Yeah. And I mean, for a long time, I used to run the Australian Technologies competition, and I think Pat Mooney is on the program here somewhere as well, and open for entries, I think, at the moment. But that was kind of the process that used to take, it's kind of how do we take really good technologies and actually make a good business? And one of the ways I used to kind of demotivate clean tech entrepreneurs was saying, fantastic, you've got a great technology. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have a great technology, and you've got now about 20% of a good business. It's a lot about the business.
It's interesting. It reminds me of a project that was done through a European foundation that gave a whole lot of money to manufacture LED light bulbs.
Okay.
And they just so that there was sufficient market for them, they agreed and bought them, and then they were deployed. And I think a lot of the challenge is, how do we create markets?
Yep.
And once we start to create those markets, then it creates greater innovation, because people see that there is a market for their product, and that's one of the key things that we need to be doing at the moment, is looking to drive those markets.
And the Clinton Climate Foundation a long time ago was, kind of trying to drive that, getting cities to buy in a big way, and to drive markets. And procurement is a huge opportunity and a really interesting one, and certainly one that governments could do more. Yeah.
It's very easy to put requirements in there, and in a former life, I was involved with a environmental certification organisation, and looking at the role that the Green Building Council played in putting requirements for new buildings. What that essentially did is the whole supply chain needed to meet these targets, and so these supply chain responses become really interesting. So you get a large company, they put procurement requirements in there, and then as a result, the whole supply chain needs to think about how they're doing things. And that can really have a really big impact, because for each of those organisations, it's not necessarily a huge change that they need to do, but without a driver to do it, they're not going to necessarily.
Yep. Now, we had a question pop up there about the carbon budgeting stuff I mentioned earlier. I don't know, Rupert, you may not have been involved specifically in that research, but there was something I was looking at recently where I think if we continue to emit globally the amount that we were in 2019, not 2020, then we have about 50 months left before we breach the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. But how's ClimateWorks used that sort of foundation in the recent stuff you were talking about?
Well, look, you're absolutely right. The issue of carbon budget means that we can't get net zero emissions and do it all in 2050. We can't continue to emit at the rate that we're doing at the moment. So the idea of a carbon budget is that there's a limit to the amount of carbon dioxide that can be in the atmosphere, and every extra tonne you put out now means you've got to put 1 tonne out later on. And so the more you do now, the more difficult the task becomes. And I think the Climate Council came out with a report last week looking at that as well. And, quite concerned about the impacts that means on a 1.5 degree target. We certainly factored in carbon budgets into the decarbonisation futures and the scenarios that we put together there, because you're absolutely right. That's why we need the action now. That's why we need the rapid decarbonisation of our budget by 2030. We can't leave it all until 2050.
And if you had your way, I think you said earlier, what would be our 2030 target? We'll make you Prime Minister for a day. And
yeah, no, I'm not sure I want that particular task. Look, I haven't set a specific target for Australia as yet. I think we're probably going to need to be getting to net zero by about 2035. So rather than 2050, we probably need to decarbonise much earlier than that. So a 2030 budget is not far off reducing all the emissions from our activities. So it's a pretty significant change that's going to be needed now.
Yep, it's going to be an interesting decade for sure. There was a question there around sort of electric vehicle policy initiatives, really, and for both of you. There are lots of different sort of policy initiatives around the world: clean energy zones, fuel efficiency standards, vehicle emission standards. We don't have many of any of those in Australia, to my knowledge. What have you seen that's been useful and most effective?
Well, Norway, I think, is probably the standout example. So 10 years ago, they had next to no electric vehicle sales each year. And last year, 50% of all new car sales in Norway were electric. And by 2025, they expect there to be no sales of internal combustion engine vehicles. The way they did that was a whole range of policies. So it wasn't just one initiative. So it was tax discounts, it was driving in, bus lanes, it was parking benefits. There were a whole range of things, and they've been able to scale them back as the take-up has increased. And certainly that's something we need to see in Australia. Less than 1% of new car sales last year were electric. We need to get between 50 and 75% by the end of the decade. And so what we need to see is a scale up of all of those areas, because what we've found is that one of the other challenges is the manufacturers are saying they don't want to bring all their vehicles to Australia because they don't see that there's a significant enough market here, and they would rather take those vehicles to other countries. So it would be great to get the federal government to do that, but there are a whole lot of measures state governments could do as well. We're seeing the ACT starting to do that, so that's promising as well.
And Damien, I don't know if you've had much to do with EVs, but there's also an interesting one there talking about how do we fast track changing the innovation system. That's a big question and probably needs a whole hour on its own. But what's
well, it probably does, probably a couple of hours. But what we don't need is another study, and which is what we've just commissioned. And so there's lots and lots of studies going about how do we fast track the innovation system, how do we commercialise more technology in Australia. I think the challenges are really obvious. Everybody who's in the field actually knows what those challenges are. I think it's about time government just said, look, these are our expectations, just as Rupert just outlined in terms of climate change. Let's get clear about what our objectives are. What are we trying to achieve? And then people start to line up to actually meet those objectives. And, if they don't, then there's got to be some penalty attached to that. In the case of technology commercialisation, then those parties that are actually hindering it or slowing it down for whatever reason, then they need to have incentives put in place to allow them to focus their attention in the right place. Because I think there's a mismatch between expectations and what people are actually driven to do inside a university, for example. Yeah. And that can be clarified without another study. I think I must have said that 4 times now, but without another study, let's just get on and do it. Let's identify what we're trying to achieve and then incentivize people to do it. and I think it should work.
Excellent. Well, that's we've solved that then. That's good. That's, just climate change now. We're nearly at the end. One final question for both of you. So the 20s is going to be a decade of being a stubborn optimist, is a wonderful opportunity of creating a better world, of transforming things and sorting everything out. What is it that excites you most about the next 10 years? What do you think is going to be the most, could be a technology or just the way the world works? What's going to be the best thing about the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. Good question. I do remain optimistic, and I'm excited about seeing where the changes are going to take place. I suspect we will see changes that we don't expect, and we will see reductions in emissions far quicker than happened before. And, you know, the changes that we saw with solar PV in Australia, and then indeed the deployment of large-scale solar, was way beyond anything that was expected before. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what's the next solar and other opportunities, and hopefully some of them will be developed here in Australia. So that's what I'm excited to see.
Yeah, no, similar nature. I'm a technophile. I love technology. So and we've never seen more technology becoming available to the world than in the current period, and that's just going to accelerate. There's so many initiatives and changes and opportunities for us there. So that's the first part, I think, built on the technology. But the really important bit is the passion of the people. To be honest, I think, as we spoke about before, the world's ready to actually make the place cleaner and better, and there's a lot of passion in the public forum, where people are debating lots of issues. Sometimes they're quite challenging, but at least people are getting vocal, and they're actually pushing their case very, very strongly across a range of different matters. And that passion, I think, is the thing that's going to ignite all the technology and make it work for us.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you both and learning from your experiences. I think the next decade is going to be an exciting ride, and I'm looking forward to it myself. So we're wrapping up this session. We are now also taking a break for lunch for the conference through to 1 p.m. You can go and look at the booths. There's a whole lot of booths of some very cool technologies and companies in the trade show. So please go and click on that. So yes, you can go and visit some of those organisations, ready to chat with them, and also you just need to click on the Expo tab on the left-hand side, apparently. So hopefully that works. Thanks again to Rupert and Damien. Great to have a chat, and look forward to having a beer at some stage, maybe. So
thanks, John.
Very good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Anna.